24-year-old David Elmquist was married for less than a year when he visited his family, saying that he wanted out of his marriage. He said that his wife of 11 months was manipulative and he was worried about discussing a divorce with her. David's parents say that he planned to move back into their house the following day. 8 hours after his visit with his parents, he was dead. The way he died was especially heinous, and investigators and David's family are at odds over what they believe transpired in those 8 hours. Today, we'll be diving into the second part of the heartbreaking case of David Elmquist. Hello my friends, how is everyone today? I hope you guys are all well. As I said in the beginning of this video, this is part 2 of this case. So if you missed part 1, I've linked it below. Pop over and watch that first so that today's video makes sense. Before we get into the case, I just wanted to run through the usual disclaimer. We discuss true crime cases involving domestic abuse and domestic homicide on this channel. So if this is not the kind of content you were looking for, I completely understand. And thanks for stopping by. If you do stick around though, I hope that you consider hitting those like and subscribe buttons because it helps to push these videos out to more people. And by doing so together, we can spread awareness of the warning signs of domestic abuse that people may otherwise overlook. That is ultimately why I cover these cases. But in saying that, I'm not a counsellor or a psychologist, so if you have any concerns about your own situation or that of a loved one, please reach out to a domestic abuse service for help. A couple of extra disclaimers here. This case also involves talk of suicide, mental health issues, and unfortunately shines a light on how first responders need more education when attending a scene where mental health is a factor. So where we left off in the last video, we were about to start digging into what could possibly have happened to David on the night of the 8th of February in 2018, just a few short hours after leaving his parents' home. Well, to begin with, all anyone had was Emily's version of events. Her account, at least initially, because it does change a bit, is that David woke her up at around 11 p.m. and told her that it was time to go, that she had to go to her parents. Wait, let me play the recording of the interview from that night so you can hear it in her own words. This was recorded in Officer Molly Sutherland's patrol car outside the apartment building as David was being taken to hospital.
The date is 2/8/2018. The time is now, the date is 2/9/2018. The time is now 19 minutes. I am here with Emily Corinne, Corrine, Elmquist, Elmquist. Date of birth is 5/30/94. All right, Emily, can you hear me okay? Yeah. So, kind of as I just explained, we're just going to go over what we had already talked about. Just start from the beginning of why you called the police today. My husband woke me up a little before 11, saying that I needed to go to my parents, that it was time. He kept saying I needed to go to my parents. You were sleeping? I was sleeping. Well, sort of sleeping, just laying in bed. In your bedroom? Yes, in my bedroom. I was kind of dozing off, ready for bed. Where was he? He, I thought, was in the bedroom too, watching news, but I realized now that he was probably out in the kitchen. He came in, he was naked, saying these things. I got out of bed, I walked into the kitchen. He said, "What's going on?" He said, "It's time for you. You need to go to your parents. You need to listen to me." I walked back into the bedroom to grab my cell phone. He came into the bedroom, he grabbed his cell phone and mine and took mine from me. And I said, "Well, I need my phone." He told me that he would give it back to me when I left to go to my parents. I said, "Okay." I went back into the bedroom to grab a shirt and I started to hear a splashing sound. I took a step out of the bedroom and I could see that he was dumping brown liquid, which was oil, over the top of his head. And it was at that point that I realized that the stove was on, the burners on top of the stove where the light was lit up that they were on. And then I noticed behind him he had a clicker lighter he would use to start a grill or something like that. I ran back into the bedroom, grabbed a sweatshirt, and tried to grab the lighter from the counter. And I said, you don't need to do this. It's going to be okay. Just talk to me. He said, no, it's time. You need to leave. And I grabbed and he still had the oil up and some got all over my arms and my clothes. And I went into the bathroom quickly to rinse off the oil that was on my arms, ran back out into the hallway area and grabbed my phone, started to scream help. He put his hand over my mouth and said, no. I was able to grab a key off of a key hanger that we have by the door, had my phone, my sweatshirt, and was able to get our dog to come out. I got into the hallway and shut the door, and I started to scream help again. There was a man that met me in the hallway, and they said, what's wrong? What's going on? And I said, he has oil. He's trying to start a fire. He opened his apartment door to get his partner out. My dog started to run into their apartment. I got the dog's attention, ran down the hallway, and while I was running, I dialed 911.
Okay, I'm going to stop it there for just a minute. I'm sorry. If you were woken by your significant other in the middle of the night and told it was time for you to go to your parents' house, would you just not ask questions? Instead, just go about collecting your belongings? That's not even bringing into the equation that your significant other was in the hospital less than a fortnight ago due to suspected psychosis. None of this would be cause for concern for you? Apparently not. Nope. Only concern is, I need my phone. Then, while your beloved is dousing themselves in oil with the stove on and you see a lighter behind them, you go back into the bedroom to get a sweatshirt? What? She didn't pick up the lighter. She didn't flick off the stove. She didn't try to talk to her husband and understand what was happening. No. She thought, bit nippy, might need a jumper. Seriously? Sorry, I'm coming in hot. Now, I know it's not the officer's job to dig into these questions and interrogate her. She is there to take the initial statement, but the problem is no one dug into these answers, questioned her timeline, or really questioned her at all. And we will get to the general consensus as to why that is shortly. Okay, so she took the time to wash her arms, and that is important. Why? Well, we might know had someone asked the question. Also, this might be a good time to address the oil. Sorry, that's the cat. We have a fan going, so I apologize for that noise. And we also have Mia Pearl in with us today. So she's, if you hear jingle jangles, it's Mimi. Okay, so this oil that Emily is so quickly washing from her arms in the bathroom was brown Bakken crude oil. Have you ever seen an oil driller? That stuff's not just washing off. David had this oil because he was so passionate about his work on the oil rig. He collected jugs from all the places that he'd worked. Anyway, where were we? Oh yes, David covered her mouth, but she was able to keep a hold of her sweatshirt, grab her phone, which I'm assuming David helpfully popped by the door so she could collect on the way out. Oh, she got some keys and of course the dog. I'm sorry, but come on. I'm sure the officer is trained to listen to these things with a straight face, but you cannot tell me that the investigators heard her calmly talk through this just an hour after it happened and looked at each other and said, okay, well, wrap it up. That makes perfect sense. Oh, yeah, I'm getting riled up. So the whole interview's a bit over 25 minutes long. I'm going to leave it there because with the way this is going, this episode will never end and my head might explode. So there's so much more to get through. So if you do want the full interview, again, check out gavinfish.com. You'll find the audio for this over there, along with so much more. The interview goes on from there, discussing David's recent hospitalisation. The officer asked about any prior abuse, to which she said there were a couple of instances fueled by alcohol, and there was an instance when he pushed me. When pressed, she said that was years ago, and it hasn't happened since. She then discusses his drug use, delving into his use of marijuana from his time in college and also in recent months. She tells of the Tuesday before David was hospitalised on the Friday and how he smoked a whole joint to himself. That's where she puts it, a whole joint to himself. I'm sorry, that just tickles me. I'm not a smoker. In fact, I'm decidedly the opposite. But even I know that a whole joint 3 days before his hospital trip was really not a huge deal. She goes on to say how she read his therapy notes and found out how much he said he'd been smoking. So, no, I don't believe what he was smoking was a big deal. What I do see as a big deal is that she got this information by reading David's therapy journal. This is not information that he shared with her. She took it upon herself to invade his private notes that he kept so he could discuss these things with his doctor. She had no regard for his privacy. She also goes on to say, I don't know how much that is, because of course she's pure as the driven snow. But I digress. Not once did she say, can I go? I need to be with him. And if I'm not mistaken, she also doesn't refer to David by name when explaining the events of the night. She calls him my husband, which, if you watch the Behaviour channel, you will know is distancing language. What she's distancing from is anyone's guess. Then once she starts talking about his medical history, the officer uses David's name, so Emily does a couple of times, then reverts back to referring to him as he. There's more to the story of what happened that night, but this was Emily's initial statement and basically all of the information that David's parents had been given also. Now, even on the face of it, they didn't understand. They'd been speaking to him earlier that day. He seemed mostly clear-headed. The text Scott received only 50 minutes before this supposedly happened had given them no indication that they should be concerned. So they just couldn't get their heads around how things had ended up as they did. So they went over to see Emily 2 days later, asking what happened. And they were in no way accusing her of anything. It was just that she was the only one there. So really, the only one who could give them some insight into what had transpired. Emily was at her parents' house, and these were people that Scott and Nancy had known for years through their church, people they considered friends. Over there, Emily was surrounded by people when Scott and Nancy arrived, so they asked if they could speak with her, just off to the side or in another room. And her mum told them no, that they could talk there. So they just asked what happened. And Emily's response was, I've been over it too many times, and that she didn't want to talk about it anymore. I'm sorry, what? Nancy tried to appeal to her, saying, please, we're David's parents. But she just refused. So the visit didn't last very long at all. I should keep my opinions to myself, but why start now? I believe this was her retaining control. Control is at the center of any abusive relationship, and this information was the one thing she could maintain control over. Seeing as she couldn't control David anymore, she could retain control of the details of that night. and she has held fast to it from that day, which to me is despicable. It also had the added bonus for her of hurting his parents, who she hadn't been on good terms with since David's hospitalisation because of the way that they'd seen her treat their son. At this time, Amy, David's sister, was not understanding her dad's growing suspicion of Emily. So at this point, Scott and Nancy asked Amy to speak with Emily, considering that they were still on good terms. They just wanted to know what had happened. Amy did, and the conversation was recorded. Emily agreed to this. The recording was so that Scott and Nancy could listen to it. However, she says that she wanted the recording deleted after they'd heard it. Amy and her husband met with Emily at the church on the 14th of February, so 5 days after David died. Amy says she stopped off so she could pick up some flowers for Emily because it was Valentine's Day and her friend had just lost her husband. She says when they walked in, all she saw in Emily's face was fear. And being the kind-hearted person she is, Amy rushed in to embrace her and told her, "Don't be like that," reassuring her. She looks back on that meeting now that she has a whole lot more information, and she feels she has a greater understanding of why Emily looked so terrified that day. Amy feels that Emily definitely knows more about that night than she's ever told anyone. This recording is also on gavinfish.com because after Scott heard it, even though Amy had every intention of deleting it, her father made sure that he had a copy before Amy could do so. So if you want to listen to it, it's over there. But the general gist of the story she tells is the same. At the end, she says she really loved him, that they weren't perfect, but they were good together, that David really wanted their relationship to work, and that he tried really, really hard. She says, quote, "And I loved him. I won't ever stop. That's all I can say. I don't have any answers. I don't know what happened. I don't think we ever will." End quote. She then says something about a sense of peace and comfort knowing that David was very sick and he's not anymore. She finishes up like she's rounding off a speech with, "I hope one day we can all get together as a family because that's what David would want." All it seems to be missing is, "Thank you, take a bow," and step down from the podium. And you may say that I'm being inflammatory or unfair, but we still don't have the full story. So let's cover the rest of what happened on the night of the 8th, going into the 9th of February 2018. We have Emily's account. The distinct change when she's speaking to Amy was that David pushed her out the door. She had also said to David's dad at the hospital that David had locked the door behind her when Scott had questioned her if she tried to get back into the apartment. The fact of the matter is that the door was not locked. And in none of Emily's accounts does she say she tried to re-enter the apartment. Emily left the apartment and went out the front. She tells Amy that she immediately dialed 911, but hers was not the first 911 call. That call came from her neighbour, who really didn't know what was going on, but was telling the dispatcher that the smoke was really bad and he was told to evacuate. Then Emily's call comes in. We don't have audio of this, only the transcript, but there are a couple of notable things she says. Initially, she says that he started a fire on the floor. She's asked if they are evacuating, and Emily replies, "He is not." But the call taker says, "I need you to keep the phone to your mouth so I can hear you. Have you evacuated?" To which Emily replies, "Yes." She's asked if she pulled the fire alarm. Her response is inaudible. But no, she hadn't. She's then asked if she saw flames. She says, "I saw smoke." After a few more questions, and Emily telling the dispatcher that she could hear the fire alarm, she's then asked, was anybody in that apartment? And she says no. There are a few more questions that the dispatcher is obviously having trouble hearing the answers to. In the end, the operator says, "I'm going to let you speak to the officers when they get on scene, okay?" Emily's response, "Okay, excellent. Thank you very much." Now, I know that they're just words on a page, but it doesn't read like there's any urgency in this call, and that's just my opinion. I'm fairly calm and collected in a crisis. But if someone I loved were in a burning apartment, I would be making that fact very apparent when calling for help. But everybody's different. That's really all we can say, isn't it? Emily had spoken briefly to the neighbour and left the building. So she was not aware that the maintenance man who lived in the building had come running when he heard all the yelling, and he was the one who pulled the fire alarm. He also grabbed the fire extinguisher, which was just outside David and Emily's apartment. He then ran into the apartment through the unlocked door, mind you, and found David engulfed in flames. The maintenance worker used the extinguisher to put out the flames, but he suffers from COPD, so he was overwhelmed by the smoke and retreated to the hall. I assumed he was thinking that David would be right behind him, but he wasn't. And that was because David had been blinded by the flames. His eyelids were actually inverted. So as the police officers arrived and spoke with Emily, David was walking blindly around his apartment. According to police, and again, all the officers' incident reports are on gavinfish.com, they state that they arrived at about 11 p.m. and while they evacuated the rest of the floor, they propped the door open and began calling to David. They received no response through the heavy smoke, so they decided to shoot out the windows to clear the smoke for the apartment. A couple of officers exited the building and went around to the side and shot out the balcony sliding door as well as a window, which turned out that the window was actually already open. Now, these weren't bullets that they shot into the apartment, thank goodness. They were what's called 30mm less lethal, which doesn't inspire much confidence in me really if it were to come to shooting someone with one. But to take out a window, good choice. The smoke began to clear and the police continued to call for David to come out. You may be wondering why the firefighters weren't set in, even though they'd been on scene pretty much since the police arrived. That would be because, according to at least a couple of the officers' incident reports, they had been advised that David had knives, leading them to believe that David was a threat. They had been told this by Emily. And because of this, they didn't enter the apartment because they didn't know where he was inside or what he was doing. Obviously, Emily was the only person they spoke to. They didn't speak to the person who'd already been into the apartment and extinguished the fire, who had seen David and saw that he was not a knife-wielding threat. They just kept calling his name. Reading these reports, it comes across as though this all happened quickly. In actual fact, they were on scene and stood in the hall calling for David to come out for 39 minutes. 39 minutes before they went in to help him? No. 39 minutes before he managed to find his way to the door and collapsed. At this time, he was asked to crawl out of the doorway over to his left. Officer Grabel says in his report, David walked from the area of the bedrooms and made it to the threshold of the doorway, where he lay down on his stomach. David was naked and his body was covered in fresh blisters. Large chunks of skin had fallen off his body and his feet were bleeding. David was conscious and had laboured breathing. David's face was blistered and his body was very rigid. He tried to speak but was unable to. However, you need to remember the Elmquists didn't have all this information in the days and weeks or months after David's death. The reality is that they have had to fight an uphill battle for years to gain access to the case files and photos of the scene because Scott just couldn't shake this uneasy and suspicious feeling. He tried to tell the investigators what had transpired the day before in regards to the conversation that he'd had with David about his relationship and how he wanted out. But the police had latched on to the mental health aspect and they told Scott that they had looked into it and said they had no doubt that David had done this to himself. That's so upsetting. Mental health issues, psychosis, or anything that falls under that banner does not automatically make a person suicidal. It doesn't automatically make a person a danger to others. And yet this seems to be law enforcement's default thinking. It's not okay. It needs to change. How many people are being hurt because of this misconception? And on the other side, how many are not getting the help they need because of it? So all of these reports state that they had attended a scene where a man set himself on fire. There was no question. They just took that as fact. One of the reports even says that, quote, male suffers from depression and has attempted suicide before, end quote, which is categorically incorrect. Where did this information come from? Is it an assumption? If it is, why on earth would it be put into a report? It was in those first weeks when everything that he said was shut down by the authorities that Scott realised that he was going to have to investigate this himself, because the police had already washed their hands of the case. That is absolutely devastating. Imagine losing your child in the most heinous way and not only being dismissed, but then having to focus on finding answers, meaning firstly, fighting to get the autopsy report and the autopsy photos, but then beyond that, having to pore over them, trying to make sense of it all while your heart is breaking and you should be grieving this immense loss. It's a tragedy. I just can't imagine the fortitude it would take to do that. David's funeral was held on the 16th of February. Scott wanted to do the eulogy for his son. Emily was not happy about this. She seemed concerned about what he might say. Amy was still friends with Emily, so she was basically the go-between because things were so tense between Emily and the family. So when Scott said he wanted to speak, Emily was asking Amy, what's he going to say? I'm David's wife. Shouldn't I have a say in what he's going to say? Amy just had to say, this is his son. My goodness, like this is something that needs to be pointed out. In the end, she relented and Scott was allowed to speak at the funeral. And Emily said, I'm going to say something too, which I'm sure was expected. You're his wife. However, on the day, people were a bit taken aback by Emily's demeanour at the funeral. She was not crying. She was very composed. And again, everybody is different. And then when she got up to speak, her words had a different effect than those of Scott's only moments earlier. Emily's speech was not really David-centric. She discussed David in terms of what he was to and for her. Then, at the end, she said something that stunned most of the people present. She said, life without David will be different, but different is not bad. Different is just different, which is enough of a what? But if you watch the Murder Between Friends episode, I'll link it below. Amy, Gabbard and Sherilyn discuss how after this, before she stepped down, Emily turned swiftly towards the photo of David that was propped beside her. But it's obvious that she doesn't actually look at him before snapping her head back. So things just felt a bit off. And David's family already had their questions, their suspicions and frustrations. But Amy, who, if you remember, grew up with Emily, but now lives in North Dakota, she hadn't been privy to any of the strange or upsetting things that Scott and Nancy had been watching over the past few months, at least not firsthand. So she was still trying to be there for Emily and be a good friend. So after the service, Emily and some other people went for a drink at a bar. While Amy sat with her, Emily was looking at the beautiful ring that David had given her and said, quote, I just don't know what I'm going to do with this thing. Should I turn it into a necklace? Now I get that everyone's different, I feel like I'm on repeat. But please, the inappropriate and awkward things she's saying are just piling up at this point. She can't be this inconsiderate and clueless. Read the room, know your audience. This is your husband's sister. He has been dead less than 2 weeks and you're discussing redesigning your engagement ring with her. She then goes on to say, I don't want your family to be mad at me when I get a new boyfriend. Who's thinking about a future relationship at their husband's funeral? Amy handles that one way better than I would have. She says, oh no, Emily, not at all. David's going to pick your new man from heaven. She's still in her funeral clothes. She's at a wake for her husband. That day was the last time Amy was with Emily in person. 2 months after the funeral, Emily posted a photo online saying, life without you, David, is different. Her mother commented underneath it, a wise person once said, different is not bad, different is just different. Reiterating Emily's words from the funeral. Now, this is a close-knit community who have been in church together for decades, as well as now being family by marriage. So, of course, they're all linked on social media. And David's mum, Nancy, saw this post and commented back, well, different to me is heartbreaking, which is a whole lot more mild of a comment than I would have made. But instead of replying something like, oh, sorry, I didn't mean it like that, Nancy's comment brought about a swift reaction, which was for Emily to immediately block the entire Elmquist family. I'm sorry, I'm trying to put myself into each of these people's shoes, and I cannot fathom why anyone would do this. Any of it. After David's funeral, Scott went to work trying to get all the reports and documentation pertaining to his son's case. This was not an easy task, but he fought on and gathered pieces of evidence as he went along. He went to the apartment building and spoke with the neighbours, who told him that they'd not been interviewed by police. The lady in the apartment under Emily and David's told him that right before the fire alarm went off, she heard a loud argument that went on for about 10-15 minutes. It was so loud that she remembers having to calm her puppy down, and then there was a loud crash. She said it was so loud that she thought whatever it was going to come crashing through her roof. This contradicts Emily's statement that she had been asleep and David just woke her up and rushed her out the door. The lady who spoke with Scott right after this happened apparently still lives in the apartment building and is still recounting the same thing she did at the time. Her story has not changed. So hopefully, one day soon, she'll be able to recount these events to someone with the power to do something about it. The police didn't speak to anyone at the apartment building, from the neighbour who called 911. At the time, the police didn't speak to the maintenance worker who'd entered the apartment, and neither did the fire marshal, not until much later. But Scott did, and he wrote this on the Truth and Justice for David Scott Elmquist Facebook page. Quote, despite the initial state fire marshal's report making erroneous statements that David used cooking oil and the stove as a source of ignition, he would later change his report and state it was crude oil that was used. He also states that no one saw the man. However, the maintenance man, as we know, was interviewed by the state fire marshal and later interviewed by David's dad, Scott. This is what they were told. Just minutes after the fire alarms went off and before the police and firefighters arrived on the scene, the maintenance man ran up the stairs to apartment 352. He stated that the door was unlocked. I didn't have my keys on me. I went into the apartment and put out the small fire in the kitchen, saw the man lit up like a Christmas tree running from the back bedroom area. I extinguished him. He then went on to say that it was a horrible thing to see and he didn't wish to think about it. Because the maintenance man had COPD and the smoke was very thick, he had to leave the apartment without David. When police arrived on the scene, they told the fireman to stand down. David was then left in the apartment for a total of 39 minutes. From when the first 911 call went in, David mustered up all the strength he had left. Burned on 90% of his body, struggling to breathe and almost entirely blind, David stumbled towards the front door of his apartment and then collapsed at the feet of those who could have helped him. Without any professional training, this maintenance man risked his life and tried to do the right thing. God bless the brave maintenance man who was the only one to offer David any life-saving measures that night." End quote. Okay, so let's have a look at the fire marshal's report. There are a few things I'd like to address in this. If this was in any way investigated, how in the world does a fire marshal mistake crude oil for cooking oil? Did he actually speak to the maintenance worker? Because he was able to recall where David was coming from within the unit. He says from the back bedroom area, and in the photos of the scene you can see the white residue from the extinguisher on the tall boy in the bedroom. Along with this, he is obviously still affected by what he saw when he found David. The call came in to 911 at 10:59 and David passed away at 2:46 a.m. according to this report. Yet in this report it states that, quote, "The male is not expected to survive his injuries." And directly under that it says, quote, "The investigation is already complete." Are you serious? David was in the apartment for nearly 40 minutes after the call was placed to 911, taking us conservatively to 11:45 when they loaded him into the ambulance. So they are saying that within 3 hours, they wrapped up the investigation into this wildly messy and quite bizarre fire case that led to someone being so horrifically injured that they're unlikely to survive. Really? That is just baffling to me. This report also states that the fire was started on the stovetop. And yes, when you look at the photos, it does look like something had been on fire on the stove, causing some soot on the wall above and to the side of it. However, where is the mention of the dishwasher, which is quite obviously melted on the opposite side of the kitchen with no damage in between? Or the charred leg of a bench outside the kitchen, pressed up against a wall that has no charring or even any soot. Don't those things require answers before you can close the case as arson/suicide? And lastly, the statement that David came out and said, quote, "He could use a drink of water," begs the question, was this person even there? 14 months later, while trying to get all this information, Scott somehow found out that David's ashes were still sitting in the vault at the funeral home. 14 months later, he contacted the funeral home and was told that only David's wife could collect them. When Amy heard about this, she was livid, as you would be. The family had been trying to do the right thing and not disclose to the public any of the things that they'd been coming across or how they'd been treated by authorities. But at this time, Amy had gotten to the point where she'd had it. So on May the 2nd, 2019, she posted this: "I will not be silent much longer about my brother's death and all of the circumstances surrounding everything from his horrific death to his remains being left in a funeral home vault for 14 months. Over the last 14 months, my family has been dealing with the most heartbreaking and horrific thing you could ever imagine. It's time for you to know what is going on. Currently praying for wisdom and the right way and words to share all of this with the world. Truth is coming. I cannot stomach this any longer. I cannot bite my tongue anymore about how my family has been treated. David Elmquist, we are fighting for you. We will never forget what you told Mum and Dad the last day of your life and how you were dead 8 hours later. We will not stop until the truth comes out. We've been quietly praying things would be resolved without too much being brought up on social media, but it looks like taking David's story to the media, to the courts, to the Star Tribune is the only way we will get the truth. Please pray for my family. The following day, Amy says that Emily went to the funeral home and retrieved David's ashes. She then took half to the pastor of the church that the Elmquists attended so that they could be given to the family. At this time, Amy heard from someone who had seen Emily that she looked scared. You may be wondering why the Elmquists were keeping quiet, why they weren't speaking out. Well, that is because they were still trying to get autopsy photos, reports, police reports and photos of the scene. They wouldn't get the police reports until 32 months after David's death, more than 2.5 years, even though the case had been closed since the night David died, apparently. That is just horrendous. The police were just trying to wait Scott out so they could sweep the case under the rug. At least that's what it looks like to me. No accusations, just my impression. Scott had a fair bit now in the way of evidence, so he hired a fully credentialed independent fire investigator by the name of Steve Thorne to examine photographs of David and the apartment. And his findings were in stark contrast to the fire marshal's report that David had lit himself on fire via the burner of the stove. Just a side note, police had to reach in to remove the towel or oven mitt that was on the burner to alleviate the smoke. I have questions about that as well, but we will get there. So just make a mental note. As far as I can gather, Steve Thorne was focused on the dishwasher being the primary incendiary location, but not what was primarily on fire, which makes sense. That is where the fire looks like it burned the hottest and fastest, which is how back-in oil burns. It's flammable, like petrol. If you've ever tried to start a fire with petrol, PS, don't recommend, but you'll know there's initial whoosh where it burns hot and fast and then dies down when the liquid burns off. Unfortunately, oil is a thicker consistency, so it would burn longer. And Steve Thorne says, quote, based upon review of the damage and the autopsy report and photographs, it's my opinion that Mr. Elmquist was the item that was on fire within the space, which we know he was horrifically burned, while the rest of the apartment is relatively untouched. Steve Thorne also looked over the autopsy photos and report because Scott had major questions about the lack of damage or even oil to David's inner wrist area. The rest of his arms and hands were severely burned. His hands were essentially what they call degloved. He'd lost all the skin from his hands. Scott had to ask the medical examiner about these marks because they weren't even mentioned on the autopsy report. No acknowledgement, no opinion on what could have happened to cause these obvious voids in the burned skin, which is mind-blowing in itself. And then when Scott asked, he was told maybe he was wearing gloves. What? That makes no sense. These two sections were the only protected areas. There were no remnants of gloves on his skin or in the apartment. Even if this ME thought this was a rational explanation, it still doesn't explain why the areas were not documented in their report. So Scott took the question to Steve Thorne and he said, quote, it appears that within a reasonable degree of certainty that this is consistent with a protected area, as if his arms were resting on the edge at or near the time of ignition of the fire within the area of origin. The width of the sink and counter edge in the photographs are similar with the markings on the anterior arm, end quote. So he's saying that David was standing at the sink with his arms resting against the bench at the sink at the time the fire was started. That's the opposite side of the kitchen from the stove where the fire marshal is claiming that David was set alight. Steve's theory certainly makes more sense considering the state of the dishwasher. The big question is, could David have poured oil all over himself and missed these two areas? Could he have set himself alight and immediately pressed his arms to the bench? On the Truth and Justice for David Scott Elmquist Facebook page, they also posed the question. We have been told that in most cases of self-immolation, the burn pattern remains consistent throughout the head and torso. David's body, however, is clearly more burned on the right side. You can literally draw a straight line down the middle of David's chest, separating the right from the left. Why is this important? It's critical information, as it seems to confirm what we believe, that David was standing or kneeling at the kitchen sink, wrists resting on the sink at the time of ignition, his right side parallel to the dishwasher, which continues to beg the question, how does one light themselves on fire, sparing only the insides of both wrists from accelerant and flames, and yet scorch the right side of their body more so than their left? There are a couple of other things to address. This bench. How is only this leg burned? If it was in this position, how could it sustain this damage while there's no evidence of a fire anywhere around it? Now let's get to the knives. There were, quote, 2 knives found on the floor near the lounge, where it seems David had sat, waiting for someone to come in and help him. But the reality is, there was 1 knife, a bread knife at that, and a knife sharpener. So let's have a look at these knives. Neither of them have any oil residue on the handles that I can see, which I would expect if David had held either of them at any point. Also, David's skin was falling off. There's no evidence of any blood or anything you would expect from someone who was that injured. There are other areas of the apartment where there is blood, but not on the weapons. Instead, what I see personally is what looks like fire extinguisher dust. If you have a look at the bench, the knife block is coated in fire extinguisher dust, but there are a couple of small voids where the 2 knives were. Also, if this jug was sitting there at the time that the extinguisher was used, why does it not seem to have any of the dust on it? The family's theory regarding the knives is that police, realizing their mistake after they entered to find no evidence that David had ever had a weapon, have them placing them on the floor to justify waiting so long to enter. So why a bread knife and a knife sharpener? My theory? Because they were unfamiliar with the knife block and they were the ones they happened to pull out. But they couldn't just put them back in and choose another because of the fire extinguisher dust on the handles. Once they'd touched them, they would have disturbed it, so they were stuck with their choices. The police took 21 photos of these knives, even though they stated in their report that neither appeared to have played a role in this incident. In Emily's statement to police on the 1st of March, she states that she tried to take a lighter from David before he pushed her out of the apartment, but she was unsuccessful. There is no lighter found at the scene. It isn't seen in any of the photos that were taken. And at one point, police said that maybe David threw the lighter out the window after setting the fire. Emily has said since that when her mother went to the apartment about a week later to clean it out, she found the lighter near the dining table. They never advised police of this or gave the lighter to them, and Emily's mother has never been interviewed by authorities. So now, over 5 years later, the Elmquist family are still fighting to have someone look over the evidence with a fresh and unbiased set of eyes. They hoped and prayed in the first months that someone would listen, that it would be investigated so they didn't have to put all of this out there into the public, but it has just not happened. I can't imagine how draining and frustrating, not to mention infuriating, it must be to have all these things in your possession that only add up to questions, not answers, in relation to your child's death, and no one wants to help you. Again, the Elmquist family are not on a witch hunt, but how can they not speculate about what could have happened to make any of this actually make sense. They have always said that they just want the truth. If the truth is that David did this to themselves, they will come to terms with that. They want someone to use the evidence to show that, not just write a report and not address everything. There is just too much that doesn't add up. It has taken me so long to go through all of this, and just when I think I know what I think, there's something else that just sits wrong. I struggled with the fact that there was so much oil throughout the kitchen, and yet when the police pulled the hot element from the stove, it hadn't ignited. And the maintenance man said he had only put out a small fire and David. It seems Steve Thorne may have given Scott an idea about this though, because Scott has mentioned it looking like there is evidence of a second pour of oil. Now that is really putting it squarely on the police, doing all of this to cover for the fact that they recognise they made the wrong call by not entering the apartment. The knife and a second pour of oil, did they also rearrange the furniture? Maybe moved that wooden bench from beside where David stood, beside the dishwasher? Then there is why they didn't enter. Did Emily tell them David had knives to delay them going in to offer assistance? What role did Emily play in this tragedy? If you believe Emily's account, they didn't argue. David hadn't discussed taking a break from their relationship and hadn't said that he was moving home. Then why does it look like he's got a pile of clothes stacked up, like he's getting ready to pack? Why is his wedding ring on his bedside table? She also said David woke her up, but it looks like his side of the bed was the one that had been slept in, not hers. If everything happened just as she said, then why on earth has her behaviour been so odd from the beginning? It's baffling. But I can look at it through a DV lens and almost see it play out. If you want to leave, fine. Don't wait until tomorrow, go now. And when he actually started to get his stuff, this only enraged her more, especially if he had attempted to pack his back in oil. Oh, so this is what's important to you, not me, not our marriage. Have it if it's so important. David was at least a foot taller than her. So to get the oil over his head, she would need a step of some sort to reach that high. Is that where the bench came in? I'm sure it all happened in the heat of the moment, but did she then set the oven mitt on the stove thinking the whole place would go up? Why would David just stand there and have oil poured over him? The Elmquists believe he may have had another episode of psychosis, and I guess that is more than possible. He was extremely pliable in the last episode, and the stress of an argument of that magnitude may have triggered an episode. But there's also the possibility that he was just trying to de-escalate the situation. If you've ever been in an argument with a person that you are never able to win against, there comes a point where you just shut down. You don't respond or react. I'm sure he never in a million years thought that this is where the argument would go. If this is what happened, and I mean, that's just me, like I said, looking at it through a DV lens with the elements that we have. Not saying that's what happened. I don't know. I wasn't there. That's why it needs to be investigated. But if this is what happened, and if you believe the police are covering their asses, they didn't only cover theirs. The other option is that David did this to himself, which of course is a possibility. Self-immolation is rare, particularly in developed countries, but it certainly can't be discounted out of hand. I personally don't think he did it, but that means believing a whole lot of people in power are doing something really shady. I must add here that this is the same police department who were tried over George Floyd's murder, and apparently they are super corrupt. But that's just me going on hearsay. Emily moved on quickly after David died. By the time she was finally picking up his ashes 14 months after his death, she was in a relationship with a man she would go on to marry. Amy discusses this on Sherilyn and Gavin's podcast, Murder Between Friends. She says how someone sent her an email that showed via public records that about 6 weeks after the Elmquists had gone public with David's story, she and the new husband had separated, and the divorce was finalised 6 months later. So I have my thoughts on that, but make of it what you will. This is such a complex case, and I can only pray I covered it in a way that offered you all the information and explained the problems within it. I know my bias shows through, and if you don't like that, I get it, that's fine. But like I say, this is a channel that covers cases of abusive relationships, and I call it like I see it. So that's all I can do. But if you've made it this far with me, thank you for sticking with me. I know it's not been an easy one, but it is a case that definitely needs more exposure. I'm hoping you will head over and sign the petition for an independent inquiry into David's death. As I said, the link is below, as is the link to the Truth for David Scott Elmquist Facebook page. And I know I've said it a number of times, but I do want to make it abundantly clear that the family are not out to accuse anyone or villainize anyone. In fact, Scott still refers to Emily as Miss X, so as not to be bandying her name about. I have no such qualms. But again, I'm not accusing anyone either. It's just something that needs to be looked into. It wasn't handled correctly as far as I'm concerned. As far as I can see, it needs to be further investigated. The family have tried as hard as they can to do all the right things and be as respectful as possible, but they are frustrated and just want their questions answered. Amy, David's sister, put a post on Facebook in 2022 where she expresses all her pain, but also speaks of her forgiveness. It says, in part, "Over the last 4 years, I've reached out and said, I'll patiently wait to hear from you. No matter what happened that night, I forgive you. But as the years rolled by and the alarming, troubling, and contradicting information has come in, it hurts. And yet some things make sense. The fearful lies, the after the funeral statements, the blocking of me a couple of months after David's death. I don't know what happened the night my brother died, but as God, as my witness, I have no bitterness or anger in my heart. I choose forgiveness. I chose forgiveness years ago, and I have peace, despite the extreme sadness that will forever be a shadow over my life. And while I will boldly and proudly take a stand and fight for answers and truth surrounding my brother's death, whatever that may be, to the woman who not one time said, 'Help David,' if you ever read this, I don't understand, but I still forgive you. Love covers a multitude of wrong. On this day and every day, I choose love, peace, and forgiveness." Neither Emily or the police department have been accused or charged with any wrongdoing at this time. And of course, everyone is innocent until such time as they are tried and found guilty. I would really like your take on this one. Please leave your thoughts in the comments box below and support the Elmquists in any way you can. I do believe that the relationship between Emily and David was abusive, so I have reacted to the information available and covered it in that way, in the hope of warning others who may face similar situations. The hope is that the more people who recognise the red flags and warning signs of abusive relationships, the less prevalent these cases will be in the future. Knowledge is power. As always, there is a list of resources below if the content of this case has raised any concerns for you regarding your own relationship or that of a loved one. But that's all I have for you today, my loves. If you are finding this content valuable, please do the YouTubey things like subscribe, share, and hit the bell so you don't lose my little channel on the interwebs. Thanks for being here, and until next time, please take care of yourselves and be kind to one another. Bye.